What did you want to be when you were growing up?
I wanted to be an airline pilot. That was from the first time I looked at an airplane in the sky. I was fascinated by them. I built model airplanes as a kid. I studied them. I joined a club in which we used to pretend that we were flying radio beams with blindfolded and with a pencil. And one fellow on one side we were going da-da, da-da, and the other side we were going da-dit, which is the way the old beams worked. I got into the CPT, civilian pilot training, which the government was doing before the war, realizing that probably we would go to war and need pilots. And I got my private license through CPT, my advanced license, acrobatics and so on. And I never had a happier day in my life than when I joined the Air Corps before the war, before World War II, but was not called in until the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And then on the 18th of December, 1941, I was shipped off to Texas to begin my flight training. And as a devoted hater of war, I'm sorry to say that the happiest day of my life was when I found myself shipped off to war to become a pilot. That's all I ever wanted to do in those days. Then when war was over, and I became a pilot for Pan American World Airways, and flying was a little more sedate, and you didn't exactly buzz cows as you in a Pan American Clipper. Then I began to sour a bit on it, and then realized that what I had let myself into was to become an international bus driver. And there's not a lot of intellectual excitement in flying an airplane. Once you've learned all of your altitudes and all of your rules and regulations, you generally sit there strapped to a seat with the airplane on autopilot, wishing you could go back and talk to a passenger.
What did it feel like the first time you ever flew an airplane?
What did what?
What did it feel like the first time you flew an airplane by yourself?
Yes, I remember that. The first time I flew an airplane by myself, it was a feeling of such exhilaration. I'd already gotten that feeling when I had done 6 hours, I think, of tandem flight with an instructor, and some of it began then. But when you get into an airplane by yourself and you take off and you're in this lovely three-dimensional world, you can go in any direction. And you go up in there. In those days, at least, the air was clean. There is just no feeling any more exciting than that. Freedom, freedom, freedom. That's the feeling you get. And my second sensuous experience having to do that was the first time I flew at night. And I remember so well because in those days also the air was clear, and over my head was this canopy of stars, like jewels in a cathedral, diamonds in a cathedral, and below me were all the jewels of the earth, the reds and the greens and all the lights down there, piled up and shining and sparkling. And it's a pity that the air doesn't stay clear these days, because it just literally takes your breath away, the sheer beauty of it.
I'm going to change your shot. Okay. Did anything unusual or frightening ever happen to you when you were flying an airplane?
Well, flying was a mixture of good things to me and bad things. Obviously not too bad, because I'm alive today. It was just a stream of consciousness running through my flying days. It was a great victory to me personally to get through cadets and not be washed out. So many boys in those days were. It was a great victory to be able to pass the physical examination. As I said, in my childhood I was somewhat handicapped. I couldn't see in bright sunlight, and then I had asthma and so on. The miracle of adolescence for me was that all those things went away. And I remember 4 of us went down to take the exams for the Air Corps, and I was the only one who passed in all counts. It's the miracle of the body changes of adolescence. And I remember the joy of doing that, the joy of passing. Do you want to get a fresh shot? I'll start over fresh on a new part of that.
Okay. Have you ever had a close call in an airplane?
Yes, I've had some. I went, of course, I had close calls too in airplanes. They were in combat in the Pacific. Had its share of, my combat had its share of Japanese Zeros coming in our formations. Can I just, we take a break for a minute and
Yes.
get my mind together?
Are you searching for his crash in the desert, Lynn, for that question?
Eventually. I'll wait. There might have been another one or something else that might have been as important. So that's why I didn't even ask about that one specifically.
That'd be
Okay.
frightening to me.
Yes.
My flying experience was basically a happy one. I remember the joy of going overseas, and I went over, supposed to be a pursuit pilot, a fighter pilot as they call it in those days, but in the Pacific, in those early days of the Pacific War, they had few fighter airplanes that could go more than 300 miles, and that wasn't very good in island hopping. And I remember being told I'd have to take some other specialty, and I was in a headquarters over in Hawaii, and I read a Life magazine article about B-17s always come back, and it looked good to me, so I went down and volunteered for a B-17 squadron, and that's what I was sent into combat, was in B-17s. It was early in the war. The Japanese had superiority in the air. Their Zeros were just a marvelous airplane. And yes, I recall many episodes of being up on bombing missions and having Zeros belly roll in at it with their guns going, and you shrink behind your wheel and wish you could get thinner. And but somehow when you're young, as every politician knows, you have no fear of death, and really when you have more to lose, you feel that you won't lose it. You certainly won't die. And I don't remember an awful lot of fear, although I don't remember being a hero either. I was not gung-ho. I didn't feel that I was on the front line of America's defense. Perhaps I'd read too much. I always felt there were some really phony things about the war, but since they said the boys had to go and I was a boy, what the hell? Why not go? And as I say, it had its enjoyable aspects. When my buddies from those days and I get together and talk, we spend most of our time laughing over funny things that happened. I did lose some airplanes, 2, toward the latter part of my flying experience. I flew 87 missions, and even then I don't remember it too badly. We crashed both times, a controlled crash, because I had a aversion to us bailing out over Pacific waters where there were sharks. I did have a friend that bailed out, and the sharks almost got him, but he broke his arm in the bailout, and so with only one hand available, he couldn't unfasten his chute, and it floating around mercifully kept him from sharks until he was rescued by a coast watcher. But I didn't have that problem. I think the scariest things that ever happened to me came some years later when I was flying for Pan American World Airways. I was heading back from Calcutta, and I was deadheading back. I was not one of the pilots of the plane, and I checked somebody out in a navigation route, and we lost our number 1 engine. And I was flying at the time. I'd taken the wheel for a while. The pilot, Joe Hart, who was killed in it, was a friend, and I said, you know, all you guys rest. I'm bored, so I'll fly for a while. I remember us discussing that maybe we'd go to Ankara instead of Istanbul, because it was a little lower route to Ankara. And we lost number one engine. I called him up. We weren't worried. The Constellation, which is what this was, an L-049, flew very well on 3 engines. And I went back and went to sleep. And I remember I was wakened by the alarm bell. I opened the curtains of the bunk, and it looked like the whole left side of the airplane was on fire. What had happened is the number 2 engine, which is the one nearest the cockpit there, had blown its, had thrown out its, burst its bearings, and they had cut the oil and fuel lines aft of the where they can be stopped, and it was spewing oil, gasoline over the engine, and we ultimately crashed in the desert. We were at 21,000 feet, and it just seemed to take forever to get down. And as the supernumerary, it saved my life. I was a supernumerary because there was panic in the cabin, and I can understand why. There certainly was in the cockpit, although controlled. And in my heart there certainly was. And I remember walking down the aisle of the airplane, trying to tell people in as calm as possible a voice that it looks worse than it is, that we know where we're going to land below, and we know what we're doing. And I was in the third to last row of seats when the airplane hit. And my images of that are looking out a window, seeing we cartwheel for a quarter mile across the desert. I remember a great flaming pool of gasoline, a glimpse of bodies writhing in the fire as they were burning, and 9 of us got out. And something happened to me that had a big influence on my life. As we were coming down, and death was absolutely certain, I was thinking all sorts of things. Scratch a message to my wife in the metal, you know. Well, what am I going to say? I love you. She knew that. I thought, well, maybe you just ought to pray. And I remember thinking that, wait a minute, you don't ordinarily pray, and I wouldn't have much respect for a God that would accept your prayers when you were in dire straits like this. He's bound to judge you on, if he's judging you on what you did in ordinary times as well as, well, he just wouldn't accept prayers. And so I remember making up my mind not to pray. I just said, okay, take me as I am. And I've always been rather proud of that you might call that dire emergency. And if you believe something in a dire emergency, it's probably what you truly believe. But it was an interesting, if you live through experiences like that, it was a very interesting experience. I had, we were rescued by Arabs. I had to make friends with them, and it was so interesting experience. I've never written a story about it because it just seems too, real life sometimes gets too phony to translate into fiction. You wouldn't believe it in fiction. I wouldn't believe the sun coming up on the desert and the survivors crouched there, and a young man from India suggesting that he imagined that many religions represented various people would like to pray thanks in their own way. I couldn't write that scene. No one would believe that scene, sun coming up, and it just seemed so phony. But the experience was full of those things.
Were you injured?
Real change.
Oh, real. Did we go through, we've already been through another real attack? Okay.
Hey, that was a good piece.
Storytelling.
I can imagine.
That's what it is.
I can't imagine going through that. I mean, you'd have
You
to
could.
experience.
Yeah.
I mean,
What we find out about ourselves is we're capable of much more than we.
Much more than we realize.
I'd like to tell my children that too. I relate these experiences because I'd like my children to understand and anyone else who cares to listen, that there really is no such thing as bravery. That we humans are capable of all sorts of things, given the circumstances. I was trapped into doing certain things as being the surviving officer of that crew, and there was no bravery involved. You just do what you have to do, and all humans are capable of that. In different circumstances, I could have easily been a sniveling coward, and with different feelings. So I'd like to say to my children, have a certain pride in yourself. You probably will be surprised at what you're capable of, and don't be judgmental about yourself. I'm so anxious that you don't look on these experiences that I happen to blunder into and say, well, that's my dad. I couldn't do that because what the hell you couldn't.
You've had a number of different careers in your life. After you got out of college or in the service, what did you do?
After college?
After
No.
the service?
No, it'd be after he's...
After Pan American.
Yeah, after Pan American, right.
When I quit Pan American because I decided I didn't want to be an international bus driver, and the thing I decided I would try is writing. Everyone considers themselves a would-be writer, and in this case I happened to make it. I didn't go directly to writing. A friend of mine, a writer who had written some novels, said to me, you don't know enough about life really to be a writer about Gene. You've seen the Pan American has shown you the world in some depth, but how do you know how it is on the streets and how people under pressure and bad circumstances really act? So I joined the Los Angeles Police Department because he said become a reporter or a cop to learn these things, and I didn't know how to become a reporter. To be a cop I paid $2. I took the exam, and I'll never regret those 5.5 years I spent on the police department, because you do see a lot of life and not only in the ghetto but in the rich parts of town. You learn that blacks are being picked up on Skid Row for gambling with dice, whereas whites in their country clubs are playing dice and attended by servants and so on, and they're never arrested, even though far more money is at stake, and probably as much or more cheating that goes on in country club card games. So you do get a lot of perspective on life. I began writing first stories for Dragnet since I was on the police department. I learned that Jack Webb would pay $100 for a story that he could make into a script. Well, having been studying writing as I was doing, I saw why a lot of these stories that my friends on the department sold or wanted to sell weren't being sold. I said to them, why not bring your stories to me and tell them to me, and then I will write them up in such a fact that they have the ingredients that a television show needs, and we'll split the money. And indeed, for a long time, I made what seemed to me incredible amounts of money, sometimes a couple $100 a week, sharing the story credits, sharing the money with my friends. And then at last I tried for a writing assignment. Did only so-so on the first. The second one got better. After I'd written about my fourth, I remember seeing a memo from the head of the studio, which was Ziv Studios at the time. We want to put some money into Roddenberry's story because we think it'll make a good film. And from then on, fortunately, I kept improving. And I became known as one of the better freelance writers around the country. And I began making more money, getting more credits, and good days. I ended up, finally, the end of that run was, I was head writer for Have Gun Will Travel. From there on, I ran on to writing some pilots. which didn't sell, but I thought I saw why. And so I said to myself, if I'm going to write pilot films, and I should then become a producer so I could put into them the actors I want, have them done the way I want them to be. And by good fortune, that worked too. And as a producer, I began to acquire some little credit. I then produced Star Trek, which was not a hit. Understand? It was, in fact, it was considered something of a failure of its 3 years. But of course, in the long run, it didn't turn out to be. And I should say to my children another thing. People talk about stick-to-itiveness. Actually, cultivate stubbornness. Screw them, I'll stick with it. And that will get you a long way on a lot of things, too.
What are some of your favorite stories that you've written?
What I like about writing is, and that's particularly come true with Star Trek, is you're able to say to the world the things you believe and feel strongly about. And I think everyone believes and feels strongly about things. Most people can only talk about it to their friends or their golf club or to their buddies at work or their women friends. As a writer, you can look at the whole world and say, I think I'll comment on selfishness, or I think I'll comment on greed, or I think I'll comment on any subject. In Star Trek, I was able to comment on diversity, the beauty of diversity, the fact the world has so many diverse elements, and we should be pleased that the world has diversity rather than longing that everything be the same. And so the joy of, I was leading to the fact that what I believe art is comment. Whether you work in marble and stone or painting on a canvas or music or what, the whole point of art is you comment on a certain thing. When Rembrandt did a painting, he was saying, this is how I see this fields and these flowers and so on. And each painter in a different way. Some commented on the riots of color that there is in the world. Some saw the world as geometric shapes. All of it is comment. Great art is not made just by beauty and detail. It is what you're saying. And of course, my writing, and particularly writing in the field of words, it gives you great opportunity. Some things I'm happy about. When we started Star Trek, we had a script come in about a monster. It was our first BEM, bug-eyed monster. And I remember saying to the writer, let's not do it that way. Let's show that even monsters have their point of view. And we wrote a show about some miners on a planet that were being killed by in their underground where they were digging for a certain precious substance. And in these underground tunnels that they were digging, they found a lot of round black objects. Well, the point of the story were these were the eggs of something that lived underground, and the reason they were killing the miners was to protect their eggs and their young. And this was a happy thought because it set the tone for all of Star Trek. Even when we talk about villains, we try to see it a little bit from their point of view too. We had very ugly villains called the Klingons, but we also wrote about the Klingon pride and being warriors and the codes that they lived by, which were different than ours, diversity, but they lived by them, and in that way they were sort of noble things. So writing is get the joy of comment. A lot of people, when you talk about this baldly, I've said to people that can you imagine how great it is to sit there and be able to propagandize a whole nation? And they have, of course, propaganda has negative tones, so I've seen them shake their head and frown and say, "Oh God, what an awful thing to have happen." No, it's not an awful thing, because I propagandize for what I believe in. Every other writer and every other person has all the rights in the world to come along and say, "He is crazy. Here is the way it really is." And another one can say, "No, this is the way things are." And it is out of this that our civilization is built, and values and judgment. So I take great pleasure out of it.